Good morning, everyone. This is Vivek Burda, a faculty and coach for the subject Business Environment from Tirthankar Mahavir University. We are again back on the next topic. In the previous session, we have taken up about the GATT and WTO. We are moving ahead in this topic and are going to cover up the remaining topics under this part. So, moving further, the next topic into this is evaluation of the WTO. The WTO has come to play a very important role in the global and thereby national economies. The national economic policies are significantly influenced by the principles, policies, and the agreements of the WTO. Because of this, there are severe criticism against WTO, particularly in the developing countries. In fact, WTO has both positive and the negative impact. The growing acceptance of the GATT WTO, despite their shortcomings, is evidenced by the increase in the number of the member countries. When the GATT was signed in 1947, only 23 nations were part of it. The membership of the WTO, which was 128 in July 1995, stood at 162 at the end of May 2016, of which 118 are the developing countries. And the number of the nations more have been negotiating membership. It is interestingly to note that the People's Republic of the China, which is one of the original signatories of the GATT, quit it in the late 1940s following the assumptions of the power of the Communist Party, but got admitted again to the WTO after prolonged negotiations with effect from January 1, 2002. The WTO members now account for about 95% of the international trade, indicating that the potential of the WTO in bringing about an orderly development of the international trade. The benefits of the WTO are that GATT or the WTO has a significant achievement in reducing the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers of the trade. Developing countries too have been benefiting significantly out of it. Second, the liberalization of the investments have been fostering economic growth of the number of the countries. The liberalization of the trade and the investment has been resulting in the increase in the competition, the efficiency of the resource utilization, improvement in the quality and the productivity, and fall in the prices and the acceleration of the economic development. Fourth, the WTO provides a forum for the multilateral discussion for the economic relations between the nations. Fifth, it is a system in place to settle the trade disputes between the nations. Sixth, WTO has a mechanism to deal with the violation of the trade agreement. Seventh, WTO has considerable research related to the global trade and disseminate the wealth of the information. Drawback and the criticism, as mentioned above, the WTO has been subjected to the number of the criticism. Important drawback criticism includes the following: negotiation and the decision making in the WTO are dominated by the developing countries. Many developing countries do not have the financial knowledge, resources to effectively participate in the WTO discussion and the negotiations. Because of the dependence of the developing countries to the developed ones, the developed countries are able to resort to the arms twisting tactics. Many of the policies liberalization are done without considering the vulnerability of the developing countries and the possible adverse effect of them. The WTO has not been successful in imposing the organization discipline to the developed countries. The developing countries have in general been great a raw deal from the WTO. It may also be noted that it has become a trend to blame the WTO even for the matters for which it is not responsible. Thus, it is necessary that the developing countries do their homework properly before they go for the negotiation table. They stand united to protect their common interest and formulate and implement the strategies to combat the threats and to take the advantage of the opportunities of the emerging world in order. Thus, the tragedy, however, is that not only the developed countries are on not earnestly implementing the provisions of the UR agreements, which will benefit the developing countries, but also the trends to become more protectionist in several respects. The irony is that while the developing countries have been increasingly opening up their market, the developed countries have been increasingly the barrier of their developing countries in several respects. Joseph, a Nobel laureate and former chief economist and the senior vice president of the World Bank, has also been to the Council of the Economic Advisors under the President Clinton, observed that the level of the pain in the developing countries created in the process of the globalization and the development as it has been guided by the IMF and the International Economic Organization has been far greater than necessary. The backlash against the globalization draws its force not only from the perceived damage done to the developing countries by policies driven by the ideology, but also from the inequalities in the global trading system. Today, few apart from those with the vested interest who benefit from keeping out the goods produced by the poor countries defend the hypocrisy of the pretending to help the developing countries by forcing them to open up their market to the goods of the advanced industrial countries while keeping their own market protected policies that make the rich richer and the poor more improvised and increasingly angry. Thus, next we go to the topic Doha Declaration. The fourth session of the Ministerial Conference of the WTO was held in Doha, Qatar in November 2001, in which the ministers from 142 member countries participated, provided the mandate for the negotiation on the range of the subject and other work, including issues concerning the implementation of the present agreements. Thus, the ministerial attracted a lot of attention because of the conflict of the interest of the developed and the developing countries. The negotiation included those on the agriculture and the services, which began in early 2000. The fifth ministerial conferences in the Cancun, Mexico in September 2003 was intended as a stock-taking meeting where members would agree on how to complete the rest of the negotiations. But the meeting was sold by the discord of the agricultural issues, including cotton, and ended in the deadlock on the Singapore issues. At Doha, the developed countries wanted a new round of multilateral trade negotiations to be launched soon, covering what was known as Singapore issues, a list of 7 items which were proposed in the meeting in Singapore in 1996 for the further negotiations. These include investment, competition policy, trade facilitation, transparency in the government procurement, environment, agriculture, anti-trade related aspects of the intellectual property right, that is TRIPS. Now, the developing countries like India, on the other hand, held that the implementation issues should be resolved before a new round. India had almost single-handedly fight against the developed countries. The Doha met concluded by drawing up the Doha Development Agenda for the new trade liberalization talk, with India approving the ministerial declaration only after it was satisfied that the conference chairman's statement has addressed the countries concerned in the 4 Singapore issues of foreign investment, competition policies, transparency in the government procurement, and the trade facilitation. Although the developed nations, as expected, won the upper hand, India's old strengths has an commendable impact because of the India's refusal to approve the agenda unless it was modified. The chairman of the meeting announced that an explicit consequences would be required at the 5th Ministerial Conference in 2003 before negotiations could begin on the highly controversial Singapore issues. It is an indication that when the strong position taken by the single developing countries can have such positive effect, collective actions by the developing countries could have profound impact. On the one remarkable achievement of the Doha Ministerial for the developing countries is that in the case of TRIPS and the public health, it allowed waiver of the patent law to face a national emergency. Now it is possible for the developing countries to set aside the patent laws if they have to face epidemics such as malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS. Each country has been given the freedom to define the national emergency. The Doha Declaration on the TRIPS and the public health was a milestone that recognized that the intellectual property rights were subservient to the public health concern. It clearly stated that the TRIPS agreement does not and should not prevent members from taking measures to protect the public health. It specifically recognizes the flexibility that the countries have to use compulsory licensing for the local production. The declaration also set a timetable for the December 2002 for which the solution of the countries that did not have adequate manufacturing capacity, but the negotiations ran around reopening them is urgent. Thus, in agriculture, it is concluded by all countries that the subsidies need to reduce and should be ultimately phased out. However, in case of the food security concern, exemptions is permitted. All forms of export subsidies will be phased out. This is a big problem for the developed countries which have been providing more mounting subsidies. The success or the failure of the developing countries will depend on what extent India can muster the support of other developing countries to fight for their common cause, as well as how well it will be do in its own homework to be effective on the negotiation table. Next is the Bali package. The 9th Ministerial Conference of the WTO held in Bali, Indonesia in December 2013. In this ministerial, all the 159 members of the WTO agreed on the package of the measures became representative, a positive step towards concluding the Doha round of the trade negotiations, which began in 2001. Thus, the Bali package, which is first set of agreements struck since the WTO was created in 1995, embodies a series of decisions aimed streamlining trade, allowing developing countries more options for providing food security, boosting least developed countries' trades, and helping development more generally. The Bali package consists of selection of the issues from the broader Doha round negotiations. It comprises of the 10 ministerial declarations covering the following three broad areas, which are described as the three pillars of the Bali package. The first is trade facilitation, second is agriculture issues, and the third is development issues. So now the trade facilitation. The trade facilitation agreement aims to streamline the trade by cutting red tape and simplifying the custom procedures. The agreement aims at simplifying not only the documentation required to clear the goods, but also the procedures employed by the broader agencies, focusing on the biggest risk, which allows the broader agencies to speed up the flow of the goods across the broad border and increase the collection of the duties. It has been described as a classic win-win subject for developing and the developed countries, since there should be no longer it contains special provisions for the developing countries to help them implement the agreement. Benefit to the world economy are estimated to be between 4,400 US dollars, 400 billion US dollars to 1 trillion US dollars. The second is agriculture issues. On the agriculture, it was decided to give the temporary protection to the food stockholding program used for the food security purposes and agreed to exercise utmost restraint in using all forms to export the subsidy and other measures with similar effects. It was agreed to improve how tariff rate quotas are managed and to add some rural livelihood and in the land use programs of the special interest to the developing countries and to list of those that can be freely subsidized. They also committed to making the progress in addressing the cotton within the agriculture negotiations. On development, it was decided to establish a monitoring mechanism to analyze and review all aspects of the implementation of the special and the differential treatment provisions for the developing countries which are contained in the multilateral WTO agreements. They also took number of decisions relating to the least developed countries, that is LDCs. These included improving the transparency of the provincial rules of the origin so that LDCs can better use the preferences accorded to them and improving the implementation of the duty-free and the quota-free market access for the imports from the LDCs. Ministers also addressed the putting into operation of the waiver allowing WTO members to grant the provincial market access to the LDC services and the service suppliers. The third is the development issue. On the development, it was decided to establish a monitoring mechanism to analyze and review all aspects of the implementation of the special and differential treatment provisions for developing countries contained in the multilateral WTO agreements. They also took the number of decisions relating to the least developed countries, LDCs. This includes improving the transparency of the provincial rules of the origin so that LDCs can better use the preferences according to them and improving the implementation of the duty-free and the quota-free market access for the imports from the LDCs. Thus, the ministers who addressed the putting into the operation of the waiver allowing WTO members to grant provincial market access to the LDC services and the service suppliers. Next, about the WTO and the developing countries. As in the case of the previous round, the developing countries in general are dissatisfied with the outcome of the Uruguay round. So, developing countries suffer in the WTO system. The Wall Street Journal has reported that while the US and the US and the European Council are getting the best pieces of the world trade pie, the developing countries are getting the crumbs. It is true that the Uruguay round mostly benefited the developed countries. That does not mean that the developing countries like India are losing. Their gain is limited as compared to that of the developed countries. Certain indiscriminate liberalization indeed harm the interest of the developing countries, particularly the most disadvantaged among them is like the LDCs, and further liberalization by the developed countries is needed for the developing countries to take advantage of the globalization. The special considerations, some of the areas like trips and trims and service have been very sensitive so far as the developing countries are concerned, as the Uruguay round agreement in their mean that the developing countries will have to lower the protection against competition from the unequal developed economies. However, as in the previous round, the UR also gives special considerations of the developing countries, particularly to the least developed countries and those with the balance of the payment problems. Thus, the agreement, however, laid down that the member countries imposing the trade restrictions for the balance of the payment purposes should do so in the way that cause a minimum disruption to the international trade, and the quantitative restrictions should be avoided as far as possible. The Hong Kong ministerial meet, which held in December 2005, also had recognized the need for the special consideration for the developing countries. Thus, the problem for developing countries need more serious consideration by WTO. The agricultural trade liberalization, indeed, it would be a developed countries who suffer most by the liberalization of the agriculture sector, but to argue that the developed countries should completely liberalize agriculture without any reciprocity on the part of the developing countries is clearly illogical. As a matter of the fact, the UR proposals in respect to the agriculture, as in the several other cases, give special consideration to the developing countries. Thus, the developed countries will, however, be hit hard. For example, agriculture subsidies in the European countries have been to the order of 30 to 50%, while the liberalization of the agriculture trade and increase in the agriculture prices due to the cut in the producer subsidies in the developed countries would benefit the agriculture exporters, and thus increase in the food prices due to the cut in the subsidies may adversely affect the food importers. More than 100 of the developing nations are reported to be the net food importers. However, the increase in the food prices should be expected to make food production in these countries more competitive, leading to the increase in the production. And it may be noted here that it has been alleged that the subsidization of the production and the export of the farm production in the developed countries would have not the effect of discouraging their production in the developing countries, where farmers have not been able to compete with the imported stuff bearing artificially low price because of the subsidies. It is estimated that since subsidized agricultural exports cannot be dumped on the world market, thus the international agriculture prices could not go up by as much as 10%. Thus, the textile trade liberalization, international trade in the textiles are estimated to be worth rupees $240 billion a year. Estimates are after that phasing out the MFA, world exports of the textile may go up by $25 billion a year. With a 2.2% share in the world textile trade, India's share in the additional exports could be $0.55 billion. But the real gain will depend on the country's ability to compete with the countries like China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, etc., which are considered leaders in the textile trade. Thus, the service trade liberalization. Developing countries were very apprehensive about the proposal to liberalize the trade in the services. However, fortunately for them, the differences of the opinion between the US and the European Council on this issue left the service sector largely unaffected. Dissimilar effect. The effect of the UR is not the small for all countries. For example, the measure which favorably affect one developed country may unfavorably affect another developed country. Further, the extent of the favorable or unfavorable impact may also vary. If it therefore quite natural that the conflicts of the interest have occurred both among developed and the developing countries, thus the Latin countries were perhaps not get interested in liberalizing the trade in the textiles because they calculated that if they could gain a direct entry to the NFTA there through some regional arrangements, it would provide them an edge over competitors like India and Pakistan. Some studies also show that the sub-Saharan African, Indonesian, and some Caribbean islands will, will be poorer as a result of the UR agreement. However, if liberalization leads to the high productivity, they would also gain. No country is therefore entirely pleased with the UR proposals. This surest proof of the success of the Uruguay round is that no country is entirely happy at the outcome. Although India is quite dissatisfied with the textile trade and is not adequately liberalized, some people in the US are angry over the liberalization move, alleging that 2 million jobs in the US would now hang in the balance. As the foreign minister of the Uruguay remarked, all nations which signed the Uruguay round trade agreement have a sense of shared dissatisfaction. As the GATT Director General Peter Sutherland stated that the sign of the Uruguay round trade pact doesn't mean that the end of the disputes. The Sutherland remarked that it is marked the start of the disputes. There will be dispute between the developed and the developing countries, between the developing countries and between the developed countries. There are more than 5 billion people competing for the share of pie, and that way will make the conflict for all more inevitable. Next is the unequal participation in it. Although it was expected that a significant benefit would acquire to the developing countries from the UR agreement, they have been encountering many roadblocks. Thus, the developing countries are disadvantaged in the WTO system because of their inability to effectively participate in the negotiation process. They are not able to understand the implications and the possible impacts of the different proposals and agreements because of their analytical deficiencies. According to Dubey, most of the agreements and the understanding reached during the Uruguay roundtable negotiations are unequal and unbalanced. From the point of view of the developing countries, this was mainly because of the weak bargaining position of these countries and their general state of unpreparedness for negotiations, and their dearth of the skilled manpower and the financial resources to participate effectively, and the lack of transparency in the negotiating process. Some of the agreements are inherently unequal and unbalanced. Besides, lack of earnestness on the part of the government is also responsible for the suffering of the developing countries. For example, the delay in taking proactive measures in respect of the geographical indication by the government of India is responsible for the basmati rice issues and the like. An IMF publication observes that while small and the poor countries have acquired a very significant say in the decision making in the WTO, their inability to participate in the reciprocity game at the heart of the WTO remains limited. These countries also pose a challenge for the WTO because their interest in the broader trade liberalization agenda is more limited, and as a result of their existing preferential access to the rich country markets. One of the underlying reasons for the developing countries not benefiting much out of the WTO is that it is mercantilist institution in the sense that the countries trade off one another protection, and you give me better access to your market, I will give you better access to my market. The currency of the negotiation in the market size, however, the small and the poor countries does not have much to offer either individually or collectively to the rest of the world in the terms of the market access. So their influence derives not from this traditional coinage of the WTO, but from the fact that the WTO is a very democratic institution and each country has one vote to make a major. Next is the implementation issues. As the developed countries have resorted to the convert measures to deny the developing countries the legitimate benefits of the proposed trade liberalization. Dubey points out that the subsidies normally maintained by the developed countries have been made non-actionable, while several of those given by the developed countries in pursuit of these export-led developed strategies have either been proportionated or put in the actionable category. Subsidies to the farmers maintained by the major developed countries have instead of coming down gone up primarily because of these countries were able to switch over the subsidized permissible under the agreement of the agriculture before the commencement of the implementation. Thus, the liberalization of the textile trade has hailed as a boom for the developing countries. However, here also the developing countries have been deceived because developed importing countries have sought to comply with the targets of the liberalization set out in the agreement of the textile and the clothing ATC by taking credit of these items already outside restrictions. As an UNCTAD report points out, the rich countries, despite their commitment to the TRIPS agreements, there have been no real steps to share their technology in the interest of the reducing the poverty. Thus, the TRIPS agreement include provisions for the technology transfer, but with few details and no discussion on the implementation. The TRIPS agreement does not provide intellectual property protection for indigenous knowledge such as those used in the traditional medicines. The TRIPS agreement introduced a global minimum standard for promoting invention. Intellectual property regimes are intended to balance the two social goals for promoting invention and promoting the use of the inventions. Thus, the TRIPS agreement incorporates the provisions in the interest of the users, such as a compulsory licensing or the parallel imports that give government flexibility to allow the local manufacturing or import of the goods under the patents. But the wording of these provisions is so vague that they are difficult to apply. So clarifying them will be the first step. Another way rich countries tilt the playing field for the trade seems on its face to have a little to do so with the trade. Rich countries to the varying degrees pay large subsidies to their domestic food producers. These subsidies are so large, totaling $311 billion a year, that they affect world market prices of the agricultural goods, causing direct harm to the poor countries. And the European Union subsidized exports have contributed to the decline of the dairy industry in the Brazil and Jamaica, and the sugar industry in South Africa. Thus, the West African cotton producers have increased the efficiency of their cotton sector, achieving competitive production costs, but they cannot compete against subsidized farmers in the rich countries. The annual agriculture subsidies in the rich countries considerably exceeded the national income of all these sub-Saharan Africa. The developing countries have identified various instances of the inequalities and imbalances in the Uruguay Round Agreement and submitted a large number of formal proposals for rectifying them. These proposals have been known as the implementation issues. It is argued that the implementation issues should be urgently resolved and the new round of MTNL should be taken up only after that. However, the developed countries want the new round of MTNL soon. The implementation issues were not a spanner thrown by the group of developing countries, our aim of new round of negotiations. Their attempt to resolve them is designed to safeguard their most vital trading interests and to restore the modicum of balance in the WTO agreements after the unfortunately belated realization that developing countries were shortchanged in the Uruguay round negotiations. What is the stake is very credibility of the international trading system in the eyes of the developing countries. Thus, the resolution of the implementation issues is the only way to restore the credibility. Conclusion: one of the achievements of the UR is in making of the rules and the regulations more transparent, thus making trade harassment and unilateral against more difficult. The result of the UR will be implemented by the newly set up World Trade Organization WTO, making dispute settlement and arbitration easier. Because of the unequal participation and lack of the bargaining power, the developing countries have not been getting a fair deal from the WTO and other international organizations. To make matters worse, and observed earlier, while the developing countries have been increasingly opening up their markets, the developed countries have been increasingly, as Chits candidly observed, the international institutions must undertake the changes that will enable them to play the role they should be playing to make the globalization work and work not only for the well-off and industrial countries, but for the poor and for the developing nations. Thus, the developed world needs to do its part to reform the international institutions that govern the globalization. We set up these institutions that we need to work to fix it. If we are able to address the legitimate concern of those who have expressed our discontent with the globalization, if we are to make the globalization work for the billions of the people for whom it was, if we are to make the globalization with the human face succeed, then our voice must be raised. We should not stand idle by. The WTO and the India, the Uruguay Round Agreement and the WTO, which has come for these scathing criticisms in India, many politicians and others have argued that India should withdraw from the WTO. Most of the criticisms are either baseless or due to lack of knowledge of the international trading environment and misinformation, and or are just meant to oppose the government by the opposing parties. Thus, should India quit WTO? Accepting the demand of some of the critics that India should withdraw from the WTO will be a great blunder that the nation can commit. By being a part of WTO, India enjoys the most favored nation MFN status, which all the other members of the WTO. Opting out of the system would mean an infinitely laborious task by entering into the bilateral negotiations with each and every one of the trading partners, which would amount to having one's arm twisting bilaterally by the US, like the European Union and the Japan, turn by turn on everything from intellectual property rights to the NPT to the human rights and the environmentally clean technology then for packaging. It may be noted that for this juncture that the China got readmitted to the system after a long wait and lobbying. One major controversy pertains to the agricultural subsidies. Much hue and cry that would be raised in India about this factor. However, it needed to be mentioned that the agreement would not adversely affect India's agriculture subsidies and its agriculture exports. The developing countries were expected to largely benefit because of the lowering of the agriculture protection by the developed countries, in spite of the fact that the wish of the developing countries, by the wish of the developing countries that the major Western nations would totally drop subsidies for their producers, substantially low tariff and open market did not materialize. However, the developed nations in the journal does not have brought about the accepted liberalization. Next is the India trade gain. Assuming that the India's market share in the world export improves to 1% and that it would be able to take the advantage of the opportunities that are created, the trade gains may consequently be placed at 2.7 billion exports per year. More generous estimates range from $3.5 billion to $7 billion worth of the extra exports. However, India's gain will be much less than those of the several other developing countries like China and the newly industrialized economies, because that the India's share in the world trade is really low. Thus, the foreign trade DGP ratio of India is low, and the gain will also depend on the rate of the growth of the India's export. Thus, the compliance measures. The India has taken several measures to comply with the TRIPS agreement on copyright, the related rights. The agreement requires compliance with the provisions of the Berne Convention, which India is signatory, and the new Copyright Act of the India already meets the requirements of the TRIPS agreement. Trade and Merchandise Mark Act of 1958 was replaced by the new act, namely the Trademark Act 1999, so as to provide the more protection of the service marks also. For the protection of the geographical indications of the goods, the sui generis legislation with the geographical indication of the goods, that is Restriction in the Production Act 1999, has been enacted in order to comply with the requirements of the TRIPS agreement and to protect the products of the Indian origin as well. The Act primarily intends to protect the valuable geographical indication of our country. The protection under the Act is available only to the geographical indication of our country. Thus, the protection under the Act is available only on the geographical indication registered under the Act of the authorized users. The Act permits any association of the persons or producers or any organization or authority established by the law representing the interest of the producers of the goods to register the geographical indication. It may be possible to argue that the holders of the traditional knowledge in the goods produced and sold using geographical indication can register and protect their traditional knowledge under this law. Thus, the Indian Parliament has passed the Protection of the Plant Varieties and Farmers' Right Act 2001 with the objective of giving a significant thrust to the agriculture growth by providing an effective system for the protection of plant varieties and farmer rights. This is expected to stimulate the investments of the research and developing both in the public and the private sectors of the development of the new plant varieties by ensuring the appropriate returns on such investments. Thus, the Indian legislation acknowledged that the conservation, exploration, collection, characterization, evaluation of the plant genetic resources for the food and the agriculture are essential to meet the goals of the national food and national security, and also for the substantial development of the agriculture for the present and the future generations. It also acknowledged that the plant genetic resources for the food and the agriculture are the raw material indispensable for the crop genetic improvements. The concept of the effective benefit sharing arrangements between the provider and the recipients of the plant genetic resources forms an integral part of our Act. India provides for the protection and enforcement of the different fields of the intellectual property through both specific national legislation as well as the Code of the Civil Procedures and the Code of the Criminal Procedures by the way of the criminal remedies and the criminal penalties. This provides effective deterrent to the infringement of the IPRs. The criminal cases and the civil suits for the infringements of the IPR lies in the judicial systems for the other cases. The amended patent law contains of the provisions for mandatory disclosure of the sources and the geographical origins of the biological matters used in the inventions while applying for the patents in the India. Thus, the provisions have also been incorporated to include non-disclosure or wrongful disclosure of the same or grounds for opposition or for revocation of the patents, if granted. To protect traditional knowledge from being patented, thus the provisions have also been incorporated in the law to include the anticipation of the intervention by available local knowledge, which includes the oral knowledge as one of the grounds for opposing, as also for the revocation of the patent. In order to further strengthen these provisions, a new provision has been added to exclude innovations, which are basically traditional knowledge or the aggregation or the duplication to the known properties of the traditional known component or the components for being patented. India is the party of the Convention of the Biological Diversity (CBD), which came into the force in December 1993. Thus, the CBD offers opportunities to the India in realize of the benefit of these resources. We have already introduced a bill in the Parliament, which is likely to be passed in the coming winter season of the Parliament in the December 2002. The proposed legislation addresses the basic concern to the access to the collection of the utilization of the biological and knowledgeable by foreigners and sharing of the benefits arising out of such cases. Various suggestions have been advanced in India to extend the protection to the knowledge, innovations, and practices, and these include the documentation of the TKs, the registration and the innovation of the patent system, the development of the sui generis system. It is sometimes believed that the proper documentation of the associated TK could help in checking biopiracy. Documentation could be a double-edged sword. It is assumed that if the material knowledge is documented, it can be made available to the patent examiners in the world over so that the prior art in the case of the inventions based on such materials knowledge as is already available to them. Thus, in the end, we can summarize that the principles of the agreements of the WTO have been significant impact on the business environment, in which the figure 38.1 provides a bird's eye view of the important aspects. The silent features of the Argy Round agreements are given below. First, the Argy Round substantially expanded the scope of the multi-trade negotiations by including services, intellectual property rights, TRIPS, and the trade-related aspects of the investment measures frames as against only goods in the past. Second, with the effect of the January 1, 1995 GATT, which was temporarily and ad hoc, was replaced by the permanent organization. Third, WTO is a GATT plus a lot more. Under the GATT, there was only one major agreement, GATT. Under the WTO, there were agreements related to the three major areas. The first is GATT, second is GATS, and third is TRIPS. WTO is more powerful and effective organization than GATT. It is more effective dispute settlement mechanism. Fifth, the Argy Round agreement seeks to liberalize trade in the manufacturers by enlarging the tariff binding, reducing tariffs, and removing the tariffs. Thus, over here in this image, the WTO and the impact the GATT and the GATS and the TRIPS and the TRIPS. GATT is basically the liberalization of the trade in the goods and services, whereas the TRIPS refers to the liberalization of the international investments, and TRIPS refers to providing monopoly power to owners of the intellectual property. Thus, in the GATT, the liberalization of the trade and the goods services further helps by increasing the competition from the foreign goods services. It helps in to facilitate the global sourcing and opportunity for the Indian firms to export, which further helps by increasing the competition. It gives threat to the domestic firms, but it benefits the consumers and it increases the competitiveness of the domestic firms. Once the competition is increased, it encourages the globalization of the Indian firms. And same way, when the opportunity for the Indian firms have increased for the export, again it will help to encourage the globalization of the Indian firms. Same way, when we go for the TRIPS, in the TRIPS, the liberalization of the international investment is seen. This liberalization of the international investment is done by increasing the foreign investment and the competition through the foreign firms. Second, by facilitates the joint ventures and technology acquisitions, which further gives threat to the domestic firm and benefit to the economy. But ultimately, it again also encourages the globalization of to the Indian firms, and also it benefits to the domestic firms. And more importantly, the TRIM through the liberalization of the international investments facilitates the foreign investment firms by the Indian firms, including the joint ventures. Meanwhile, the TRIPS, which provide monopoly power to the owners of the intellectual property, it further helps to encourage the globalization of the firms. This particular image. Anyways, we are moving back to the silent features of the Argy Round. The sixth point over here is say that a significant achievement of the UR is the measures of the liberalized trade in the agriculture, which was highly protected sector, particularly in the developed countries. And these measures are traffication, traffic binding, traffic cuts, and reduction in subsidies and the domestic support. All member countries are required to adopt product patents and also the process patents, and India has only processed the patents for the drugs, food, and the chemical substances, for which the patent period was 7 years and 14 years for the other products. Under the WTO regime, the patent period has for all the products in is 20 years. As under GATT, under the WTO, also developing countries, particularly the least developed countries, are accorded a number of concessions and favors. Their liberalization requirements are lower and are allowed longer period to fulfill the liberalization commitments. Thus, the WTO also calls upon the developed nations to grant the special preferences to import from the developed countries. There are also some committees under the WTO to look after the interests and the special needs of the developing countries. 9. There is a general complaint that the fruits of the liberalization accrue mostly to the developed countries. Thus, it is pointed out that the industrialized countries, which make up only 20% of the membership, will appropriate around about 70% of the additional income generated by the implementation of the UR agreements. And the losers, mostly in the African and the Caribbean, are some of the poorest countries in the world. Thus, the developed countries gain substantially because of the higher level of the participation in the trade, and because of the fact that the significant part of the liberalization has been investment of the goods of the interest of them. Liberalization of the trade in textile by phasing out MFA, however, will substantially benefit the developing countries. 10. Even after all UR concessions are fully implemented by the industrialized countries, the significant trade barrier in the form of high tariff peaks exceeding 12%, but in some cases reaching or exceeding 300%, will continue to affect many exports from the developing countries. Thus, the removal of such barrier needs to be given priority, and there are several other areas to be critically important of the developing countries. 11. Developing countries are terribly disadvantaged due to the participation gap. 12. India has taken several measures to comply with the TRIPS agreement. This include amendments to some laws and new legislations. 13. The estimates of the India's possible gain from the trade liberalization vary wide, between $2 billion and $7 billion a year. Although the liberalization of the trade in the textile will benefit the developing countries, India's gain will depend a lot on their competitiveness strength vis-a-vis to the other textile exporters. India gain from the trade liberalization will be much less than that of the many other developing countries such as Southeast Asian economies, China, because India's share in the world trade is very low, and their foreign trade GDP ratio is also very low. This is all about this, and there are a large number of things which you can refer as in reference to the GATT and the WTO. Thank you. This is for the today's class. This is your faculty and coach Vivek Birda from TMU for the subject business environment. For any issues or any doubts, you can get back to me on the email ID vivekb.management@tmu.ac.in.